Chapter 11 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 7, by John Hay and John George Nicolay, Chapter 11, Port Hudson. The great work of freeing the Mississippi was not complete when the flags of truce fluttered from the works of Vicksburg. 200 miles below, the Confederate flag still waved defiantly from the stronghold of Port Hudson. A brief review of the state of things in the Department of the Gulf is necessary to explain the circumstances under which this last river fortress fell. General Banks had dispatched to the Department of the Gulf in the autumn of 1862. He carried with him from New York a strong force of troops, not much less than 20,000 men, and instructions to advance up the Mississippi with the forces he took and those he should find in Louisiana, to act in cooperation with General Grant to clear the river, after which he was to establish a line of land communications from New Orleans to Vicksburg, and then to plant himself in the Red River country in such a manner as to protect Louisiana and Arkansas, and form a basis for future operations against Texas, a subject which, in view of our relations with Mexico, greatly occupied at that time the mind of the President. Before he sailed, he made so large a requisition for supplies of all sorts as to strike the President with dismay. He sent it back to the General with this sermon of kindly severity: "Early last week you left me in high hope with your assurance that you would be off with your expedition at the end of that week, or early in this. It is now the end of this, and I have just been overwhelmed and confounded with the sight of a requisition made by you, which, I am assured, cannot be filled and got off within an hour short of 2 months. I enclose you a copy of the requisition, in some hope that it is not genuine, and that you have never seen it. My dear General, this expanding and piling up of impedimenta has been, so far, almost our ruin, and will be our final ruin if it is not abandoned. If you had the articles of this requisition upon the wharf, with the necessary animals to make them of any use, the forage for the animals, you could not get vessels together in 2 weeks to carry the whole, to say nothing of your 20,000 men, and having the vessels, you could not put the cargoes aboard in 2 weeks more. And after all, where you are going, you have no use for them. When you parted with me, you had no such ideas in your mind. I know you had not, or you could not have expected to be off so soon as you said. You must get back to something like the plan you had then, or your expedition is a failure before you start. You must be off before Congress meets. You would be better off anywhere, and especially where you are going, for not having 1,000 wagons doing nothing but hauling forage to feed the animals that draw them, and taking at least 2,000 men to care for the wagons and animals who otherwise might be 2,000 good soldiers. Now, dear General, do not think this is an ill-natured to Banks letter. It is the very reverse. The simple publication of this requisition would ruin you. General Banks wasted no time after his arrival at New Orleans, which was about the middle of December. Before disembarking his troops, he sent 10,000 of them under General Cuvier Grover to take possession of Baton Rouge. As Grover did not consider himself strong enough at that moment to take Port Hudson, which was 25 miles further up the river. The next movement Banks made was not so judicious. Harassed by the entreaties of General Andrew J. Hamilton, the military governor of Texas, and a rather disreputable lot of local politicians whom Hamilton kept about him, he sent a small detachment to take possession of Galveston on the Texas coast, which, as soon as it landed, was captured by an overwhelming force of Confederates under J.B. Magruder, the gunboat Harriet Lane being taken at the same time, and her gallant commander J.M. Wainwright killed. This happened on January 1st, an inauspicious opening for the new year. Later in the same month, General Banks set on foot an expedition to move up the Bayou Teche, and in connection with another force, which was to leave the Mississippi River at Plaquemines to take the post at Butte a la Rose. But the Bayou Plaquemines was found to be absolutely impassable, and the expedition was finally abandoned at the request of Admiral Farragut, who was proposing to run past the Port Hudson batteries for the purpose of patrolling the river between that point and Vicksburg, and who asked General Banks to make a demonstration by land to assist him. This he did, moving in the rear of Port Hudson on the 14th, and occupying the attention of the enemy by slight skirmishing, while Farragut with the Hartford and Albatross successfully passed the batteries on the river, the rest of his fleet, however, having failed to follow him. Banks, not having the force to make a serious attack on the Confederate works, brought his men back to Baton Rouge, and himself returned to New Orleans. He was criticized in the report of the General-in-Chief for not having invested Port Hudson at that time, but General Halleck was manifestly in error in his censure, as the rebel forces at Port Hudson were then at their maximum. The official returns for that month showed a total of 20,000 men, with 16,000 ready for duty. The Confederate forces in Louisiana were, at that time, commanded by General Richard Taylor. They had a post called Fort Bisland at Berwick, at the western terminus of the railroad connecting New Orleans and Brashear City. They had full command of the country from that point to Alexandria, where a strong force called Fort de Russy commanded the Red River. It was to break up the rebel force upon this line that Banks had projected the movement in the winter, and he now made preparations as promptly as possible, considering the difficulties under which he labored from deficiency of transportation, to resume that interrupted enterprise. He started on the 11th of April with about 17,000 men, and after a sharp skirmish his troops captured Fort Brisland, the Confederates retreating northward to Opelousas. Banks followed in keen pursuit and took Opelousas on the 20th of April. Butte a la Rose was captured at the same time by the gunboats, and Banks, moving northward, arrived on the 9th of May at Alexandria, driving the Confederates northward to Shreveport. Farragut's vessels, strongly reinforced by Porter, joined the troops at Alexandria, and a very large extent of eastern Louisiana was thus practically restored to the possession of the Union. Banks had acted with promptness and vigor, and Banks, with a loss of only about 600 men, he had captured 2,000 prisoners and 22 guns, and had taken or destroyed great quantities of property of value to the enemy. This enterprise, however successful and judicious as it is now seen to be, did not meet the approval of the General-in-Chief, whose mind was fixed upon the purpose of a junction between Grant and Banks to act successively against Port Hudson and Vicksburg. General Banks and General Grant, during the months of March and April, were continually in correspondence, with the purpose of effecting this object, but, with the utmost goodwill on both sides, it was found to be impracticable. In the first place, the difficulties of communication between the two generals were enormous. Their letters were weeks in reaching each other, and every movement proposed in one became obsolete long before the answer was received. From this cause a serious misunderstanding arose between Halleck, Grant, and Banks, for which neither of the three can be properly blamed. Grant made a conditional promise of reinforcement to Banks in a letter of the 23rd of March, but Banks received it on the 21st of April, after the situation was materially changed. Banks wrote to Grant on the 10th of April, telling him when he could join him, and with what force. But this letter came to the hands of Grant only after the victory of Port Gibson had opened to Grant the way to Jackson. While Grant was concentrating his forces at Grand Gulf, he sent a dispatch to Banks, engaging him to send him an army corps to Bayou Sara by the 25th to cooperate with him on Port Hudson, and asking if, after the reduction of Port Hudson, Banks could assist him at Vicksburg. A month passed before the dispatch reached Banks, and being repeated to him from New Orleans without giving date, he naturally understood the 25th to mean the 25th of May, and so answered that he would be there, probably by the 25th, certainly by the 1st, meaning the 1st of June. But as we have seen, before this answer reached the hands of Grant, he was far on his way toward the capital of Mississippi, all thought of waiting for Banks' assistance having long ago passed from his mind. He responded instantly, however, explaining why he had not waited for Banks, and urged Banks either to join him or send all the force he could spare to cooperate in the great struggle. This dispatch was promptly delivered, reaching Banks at Alexandria on the 12th of May. He answered, regretting the impossibility of joining Grant for the perfectly valid reason they had neither water nor land transportation to make the movement. He gave General Grant in this letter a full and accurate account of his situation, and announced to him his intention of investing Port Hudson, which was unquestionably the wisest thing he could do. Banks put his troops at once in motion across the Atchafalaya on the 9th of May, marched down the bank of the Mississippi to the point opposite Bayou Sara, where they were slowly and toilsomely ferried across the river, and then moved swiftly to Port Hudson, arriving there on the 24th of May, and meeting C.C. Augur's division, which had been directed to join him from Baton Rouge. The junction was effected successfully after a slight skirmish with the enemy, whom Augur promptly repulsed. The works of Port Hudson were very strong, too strong, as it appeared in the end, to justify an assault from a force so little superior as was Banks to that of the enemy. But the same consideration which impelled Grant twice to assault the works of Vicksburg induced Banks to take the same action. He assaulted on the 25th, immediately after his arrival, and again on the 14th of June. The result of these two attacks was precisely the same as in the case of Grant. No benefit was derived from them, except a slight advance in position, which, however, did not compensate for the terrible loss of life involved. The curious parallelism between the cases of the two commanders is continued also to the extent of their losses. About 4,000 men were lost in the assaults at Vicksburg, and nearly the same number at Port Hudson. Siege operations were then resumed, the investment rendered absolutely complete, and the garrison in Port Hudson held with a steadily tightening grasp until the end. Banks was not left to complete the capture of the place at his leisure. He had not only the care of the enemy inside the works upon his mind, but he was painfully drawn in two other directions at once. General Halleck was writing dispatch after dispatch, commanding him with the most cutting emphasis to go to the assistance of Grant. General W. H. Emory, whom he had left in charge at New Orleans, was sending the most importunate appeals to him to return to that city, or all would be lost. Even while the Confederate troops were marching out of the works at Vicksburg, Emory wrote, "I respectfully suggest that unless Port Hudson be already taken, you can only save this city by sending me reinforcements immediately and at any cost. It is a choice between Port Hudson and New Orleans." But disregarding the importunities from both quarters, both imperfectly advised of the real state of affairs, Banks pursued the judicious course of standing by the work in hand. The danger to which General Emory referred was by no means imaginary. New Orleans was more severely menaced than at any other time during the war. General Taylor, after the unsuccessful attack upon Milliken's Bend, had returned to Alexandria and organized a considerable force, variously estimated at from 3,000 to 5,000 men. With this he had moved in 2 detachments upon Berwick Bay. He sent Colonel J. P. Major with a force of cavalry by way of Plaquemines to attack Brashear City in the rear, while with Generals Alfred Mouton and Thomas Green he moved his main force down the Tech, and the 2 forces came together on the 24th exactly at the time ordered. Taylor captured the place, taking several hundred invalid and convalescent prisoners and a large amount of valuable stores. He then sent General Greene, assisted by Major's cavalry, to Donaldsonville, midway between New Orleans and Port Hudson, while he pushed another party to within 25 miles of New Orleans, creating little less than a panic in the city, which justified General Emory's dispatch to Banks. On the 28th, Greene attacked Donaldsonville, which was protected by a small earthwork and garrisoned by only 225 men of the 28th Maine Regiment, under Major J. D. Bullen. The assaulting force was about 10 times that of the defenders. They attacked a little after midnight, and met with a severe repulse at the hands of the gallant little garrison and the gunboats in the Mississippi. They withdrew several miles down the river, and there erected batteries which, if they could have been made permanent, would have placed Banks' army and the city of New Orleans in a most critical position. But the tremendous events which were taking place along the river rendered the well-laid plan of Taylor of little avail. When the great news of Vicksburg arrived in the Union camp around Port Hudson, it was greeted with the thunder of artillery and the joyous shouts of Northern soldiers. The Confederate pickets, who had already established the same social relations, modified by rifle practice, which had been so long in force at Vicksburg, inquired of the cause of this rejoicing, and General Gardner became thus informed of the uselessness of further resistance. He surrendered the place on the 9th of July. Weitzel and Grover were at once sent down to Donaldsonville, and after a sharp engagement in which neither side gained any special advantage, the Confederates withdrew to Brashear City, whither they were not very vigorously pursued. Banks retook the place on the 22nd of July, and Taylor moved northward along the line of the Tech, where he passed the winter. The fruits of Banks' victory were about 6,000 prisoners actually paroled. If we add to this the 500 sick and wounded in the hospitals, and nearly 800 lost during the siege, it will be seen that the campaign of Port Hudson added 6,340 men to the grand aggregate taken from the Confederacy in this summer's work. They lost 51 pieces of artillery and over 5,000 small arms. It seemed as if the stars in their courses were fighting to make everything, east and west, gilt with new luster the anniversary of American independence. One of the most brilliant of the minor victories of the war was gained at Helena, Arkansas, on the west bank of the Mississippi, on the 4th of July. General Holmes had asked and received permission to take that place in the middle of June, and had mustered for the purpose an army of nearly 10,000 men. The garrison at Helena consisted of a division of the 13th Corps and a brigade of cavalry numbering in all 4,000 men, commanded by Major General B. M. Prentiss. Holmes felt so sure of victory that he doubtless selected the 4th of July for his attack in a mere spirit of bravado. He assaulted at daylight with converging columns, two of which made considerable impression upon the outworks, but never reached the town. The defense of the Union troops was singularly skillful and energetic, and after a few hours of fighting, Holmes, finding himself utterly defeated, retired at 10:30. The little army of Prentiss was, of course, too small to pursue. The last Confederate attempt to hold the Mississippi River thus ended in a complete and most humiliating repulse. Sherman, who had been ordered by Grant to hold himself in readiness to set out in search of Johnston the moment Vicksburg fell, had obeyed the order with such efficiency that, although the city surrendered 2 days before the proposed assault, Sherman was ready to start within an hour from the time when the Confederates stacked their arms. He took with him a splendid army consisting of the 13th, 15th, and 9th Corps, holding the center with his own, with Ord on the right and Parke on the left. In this order they marched rapidly on the track of Johnston, over roads thick with dust and in weather of tropical heat. There was very little water to be had along the route, and Johnston had taken pains to spoil even that scanty supply, wherever possible, by driving cattle, hogs, and sheep into the ponds and shooting them there. But these were light afflictions to Sherman's hardy veterans, and they arrived on the morning of the 9th in robust health and high spirits before the field works in front of Jackson. Here General Johnston awaited them in the full hope and confidence that they would be compelled to attack him for want of water, and safely established behind his earthworks, he counted on them, inflicting a severe repulse upon them. But when 2 days had passed, and instead of a dash upon his fortifications, he found that Sherman had quietly extended his flanks to the Pearl River above and below the town, and was preparing entrenchments for his formidable artillery, Johnston's heart failed him, and he telegraphed to Jefferson Davis that it would be impossible, for want of supplies, to stand a siege, and that therefore, unless the enemy attacked him, he must abandon the place. Hot skirmishing began on the 12th, with continually increasing fire of artillery. General Lauman, with misdirected zeal, went too far near the Confederate works and was severely handled, both in front and in rear, we might say, for at General Ord's request he was relieved from his command, a punishment rather too prompt and severe for a single error of judgment on the part of an officer of great courage and merit. An attempt was next made by General Johnston to cut off Sherman's artillery train, which his scouts had reported as approaching by the Jackson road. But this failing, and Johnston having heard that the train was near the Federal camp, he decided to evacuate the place, and accomplished it with that singular skill and address which never failed him on such occasions. He crossed the river upon bridges inside of his lines without exciting the least suspicion on the part of his accomplished adversary, and Sherman, for the second time, entered the capital of Mississippi, from which Johnston had retired in perfect safety, and was now miles away. He was followed a little distance, but Sherman, concluding that pursuit in that torrid weather would be fatal to his army, he returned to Vicksburg and went into camp. The great work was done. The Army of the Tennessee and its commanders received the enthusiastic plaudits of a grateful country. Grant was made a major general in the regular army. Sherman and McPherson were promoted to be brigadiers in the regular service. There was no cloud upon their satisfaction over a great duty well performed. As General Halleck said in his dispatch of congratulation, they could feel that they had deserved the gratitude of your country, and it will be the boast of your children that their fathers were of the heroic army which reopened the Mississippi River. Up to this time, no general in the field had shown less thought than Grant of his personal future, or of those prospects which are so frequently presented to the imagination of successful military leaders. But it is recorded that he said many years afterward, in one of those characteristic phrases of simple directness peculiar to him, "After the capture of Vicksburg, I regarded it as probable that it would fall to my lot to command the army and to end the war." One of the minor crosses which successful soldiers are called upon to bear is the imputation that the plans of their triumphant campaigns were suggested by subordinates or dictated by superiors. But in the case of General Grant, fortunate in this as in everything else, the door was forever closed against such an imputation by the swift and generous testimony of his superiors and his most intimate subordinate. Sherman lost no time in saying that the plan of the Vicksburg campaign was Grant's, and Grant's alone. General Halleck gave him this unqualified and ungrudging praise: "In boldness of plan, rapidity of execution, and brilliancy of results, these operations will compare most favorably with those of Napoleon about Ulm." While from the President came the following letter, which we believe no other ruler that ever lived would have had the magnanimity to write: "My dear General, I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgment for your almost inestimable service you have done the country. I wish to say a word further. When you first reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do what you finally did: march the troops across the neck, run the batteries with the transports, and thus go below. And I never had any faith, except a general hope that you knew better than I, that the Yazoo Pass expedition and the like could succeed. When you got below and took Port Hudson, Grand Gulf, and vicinity, I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks, and when you turned northward, east of the Big Black, I feared it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgment that you were right and I was wrong." There remained but one act to close the mighty drama of the struggle for the great river of the West, which for 2 years had shaken its bluffs, with the thunder and of artillery, and had reddened its turbid waters with the blood of brothers. This was accomplished on the 16th of July, when the steamboat Imperial quietly landed at the wharf in New Orleans, arriving direct from St. Louis, laden with a commercial cargo, having passed over the whole course of that great thoroughfare of commerce undisturbed by a hostile shot or challenge from bluff or levee on either shore. End of chapter 11.